Good evening. My name is Susan Derwin, and I am the director of UCSB's Interdisciplinary Humanities Understanding of the challenges we all face as local and global citizens, and prepare us to address those challenges in informed, impactful, and compassionate ways. I am very happy you've decided to join us for the inaugural lecture of the IHC's public events series, Living Democracy. For the next 8 months, scholars, activists, writers, and artists taking part in the series will examine the forces that weaken democratic culture and the conditions under which an equitable, vibrant, and just democracy can thrive. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to make sure you are aware of the question and answer function on your screen. You can submit questions to our speaker in English or Spanish anytime during the event, and when our speaker concludes his presentation, we will pose as many of your questions as possible to him. I want also to extend our thanks to the Spanish interpreters for this event, Professors Viola Milio and Alini Ferreira, as well as to the ASL interpreter, Katie Voice. Thanks go as well to IHC Associate Director Erin Nerstad, Assistant Director Adam Morrison, and Senior Artist Paula Schaefer, all of whom have done their utmost to make today's event run smoothly. We are fortunate to have John Majewski as the inaugural speaker for Living Democracy. John Majewski is UCSB's Michael Douglas Dean of Humanities and Fine Arts and a faculty member in the Department of History. His areas of specialization include American economic, social, and legal history, Southern history, and the U.S. Civil War. He is the author of 2 books, A House Dividing, Economic Development in Pennsylvania and Virginia Before the Civil War, and Modernizing a Slave Economy, the Economic Vision of the Confederate Nation. Professor Majewski has also published numerous articles, reviews, and book chapters in his fields of study. It's an honor to welcome John Majewski to the IHC to present his lecture, Living Democracy in Capitalism's Shadow: Creative Labor, Black Abolitionists, and the Struggle to End Slavery.
Thank you. The extraordinarily high quality speakers and program that will be coming up in the next 9 months as well. Let me begin my talk with the story of James Pennington, a young enslaved blacksmith who escaped bondage to a new life in the northern United States. Pennington had experienced all of the cruelties of enslavement: long hours of work without compensation, forced separation from beloved family members, and arbitrary violence directed at himself and his parents. Yet for all this physical and psychological abuse, Pennington wrote in 1849 that the worst element of enslavement was the systematic denial of education. When he escaped, Pennington was functionally illiterate. "There is one sin that slavery committed against me, which I can never forgive," he wrote. "It robbed me of my education." When he escaped, Pennington had to quickly make up for his lost years of learning, and he became a voracious student. He quickly learned to read and write, and within a year of his escape, he became a teacher and then a minister. He wrote a slave narrative, authored a global history of Black peoples, and lectured extensively in the United States and Great Britain. In 1849, the University of Heidelberg granted Pennington an honorary degree in theology, cementing his reputation as one of the most learned advocates of abolitionism and Black civil rights. Even his surname, which referenced his efforts to fashion the steel writing pen when he was still an enslaved blacksmith, demonstrated his yearning for literacy, learning, and enlightenment. Pennington's moving story highlighted how the mental darkness forced upon the enslaved became an increasingly important theme for abolitionists in the 2 decades before the US Civil War. The focus on education and learning was somewhat new in the 1840s and 1850s. Earlier arguments from abolitionists, who favored the immediate and unconditional end to slavery, focus on physical abuse, sexual exploitation, and forced family separations. Key abolitionist works in the 1830s only mention in passing the denial of education, while early slave narratives and testimonials said relatively little about literacy in enslavement or its absence. That changed markedly in the 1840s. The narratives of Pennington and other escaped slaves often focused in different ways on the relationship between literacy and enslavement. In this talk, I explore why the relationship between slavery and literacy became increasingly important in the 2 decades before the Civil War. I connect the great interest in slavery and literacy to a new form of capitalism that I call creative capitalism. As the name implies, creative capitalism stressed innovation, imagination, and invention. In the pre-Civil War North, creative capitalism included widespread schooling, a booming print culture, and a robust civil society. As we will see, creative capitalism led to startling high levels of inequality and would eventually reinforce systematic racism. But before the Civil War, it presented Black abolitionists with new rhetorical possibilities. We might think of creative capitalism as inadvertently building a door to the hearts and minds of the Northern middle class, a door that was inordinately heavy and difficult to move, but left ever so slightly ajar. With brilliantly told stories of inventive escapes, stolen literacy, and corrupted enslavers, Black abolitionists managed to push open that door. Their creative labor as writers and lecturers helped convince middle-class Northerners that a society built on education, innovation, and free speech was fundamentally incompatible with a society based on slavery, violence, and censorship, setting the stage for the election of Abraham Lincoln, Southern secession, and slavery's abolition. At the end of my talk, I speculate how the creative labor of Black abolitionists has implications for today as we try to live democracy in the shadow of a new form of creative capitalism and rising inequality. Let me briefly sketch out what I mean by creative capitalism. Creative capitalism, simply put, commodifies creativity. It converts imagination and novelty into goods and services with a market value. Patents embodying the application of scientific and engineering imagination, for example, became important commodities in the pre-Civil War period, in which inventors exploited the patents for commercial gain. Before the Civil War, Americans patented nearly 41,000 inventions, making the United States the world leader. A favorite tourist attraction in Washington, D.C., in fact, was the Patent Office, where tens of thousands of visitors flocked to view models of inventions submitted with patent applications. Patents represented the commodification of scientific imagination, but artistic imagination became commodified as well. 19th century Northerners eagerly participated in commercial markets for paintings, photography, novels, poetry, musical scores, theatrical performances, and other art forms. A vibrant and richly illustrated print culture, made vastly less expensive through the steam-powered printing press, was especially important. The commodification of art extended into the realm of design as consumers increasingly valued the aesthetics of goods. For the Northern middle class, fashion became more widely available as bodies and living spaces became venues of creative expression. Creative capitalism depended on a creative and technological infrastructure to rapidly circulate knowledge and information. Widespread education allowed particularly talented, curious, and creative individuals to discover their talents, while building a mass market for books, periodicals, images, and other creative products. Transportation improvements, such as the railroad, created new markets, while the explosion of libraries, scientific institutes, lyceums, and other institutions increased the circulation of knowledge and information. Creative capitalism interacted with other forms of capitalism, such as financial capitalism, but creative capitalism achieved a far greater cultural salience. Northerners noted with pride that their level of schooling, literacy, and inventive activity were among the highest in the world. In 1858, a relatively unknown Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln gave a lecture on discoveries and inventions. Lincoln lightheartedly mocked his fellow Northerners for their pretensions, observing that, quote, "We here in America think we discover and invent and improve faster than any other nation." Yet in the end, he too viewed the discovery of America as an event greatly favoring and facilitating useful discoveries and inventions. Indeed, Lincoln embodied the values of creative capitalism. An accomplished lawyer, he enthusiastically supported railroads, argued patent cases, mastered political rhetoric, and on the side, read mechanical engineering. To this day, he is the only president to hold a patent, devising in a system of inflatable bellows that would lift steamboats across obstructions in shallow waters. Creative capitalism presented abolitionists, particularly Black abolitionists, with an opportunity to expand their message. Abolitionists took advantage of the latest printing and communication technologies to distribute thousands of pieces of abolitionist literature every year. Hundreds of local abolitionist societies formed libraries so they could distribute that literature with little or no cost to readers. Free Blacks in northern cities were especially eager to take advantage of whatever opportunities creative capitalism offered. Scholars have carefully documented how free Blacks established their own schools, published their own newspapers, ran their own bookstores, organized their own libraries, and created their own literary societies. These institutions celebrated Black writers and thinkers, such as the New England poet Phyllis Wheatley and the scientist Benjamin Banneker, while demonstrating their own right to equality and citizenship. The education and literary institutions of the free Black community produced important public intellectuals and provided critical support for the abolitionist movement. Creative capitalism also presented an opportunity for a new substantive critique of slavery. The slave South clearly failed to develop the same creative economy and infrastructure of the North. In most Southern states, it was illegal to teach the enslaved to read, and historians estimate that only 5% of the enslaved were literate. Even among whites, the South lagged far behind in measures of creative and educational achievement. The South contained 30% of the nation's white population in 1860, but only accounted for 5% of the nation's patents. Less than a third of the South's white children attended school in any given year, and the rate of illiteracy among white Southerners was at least 3 times higher than Northern whites. The South's relatively uneducated and dispersed white population supported only small and struggling local publishers. The national publishing firms were concentrated in northern cities. Southerners lagged so far behind in engraving, printing, and paper making that they struggled to print their own currency during the Civil War. They also lagged far behind in establishing libraries, lyceums, museums, and other civil society institutions. Abolitionists could make a compelling case that the violence and brutality of a slave society was fundamentally incompatible with the economic and moral vision of creative capitalism. Nobody could make that case better than those who had escaped from slavery. In a series of popular narratives and autobiographies, fugitive slaves demonstrated that the act of escaping was an act of creativity, embodying both carefully planned deception and quick thinking. Benjamin Brown literally shipped himself in a box from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and during a 27-hour trip. William and Ellen Craft took a series of trains, stagecoaches, and steamboats from Georgia to Philadelphia, with the white-skinned Ellen disguised as a white Southern gentleman, and William playing the part of the loyal manservant. James Pennington had an easier journey walking from Maryland to Pennsylvania, but he was eventually caught in the heavily patrolled border. Cunningly telling his captors that he had escaped from a slave coffle infected with smallpox, he found himself guarded by a single anxious magistrate, which enabled him to escape. In similar fashion, the fugitive slave William Henry Bibb, who could pass for white, pretended to be a blustering land speculator from Ohio who made his way across the slave state of Missouri. Although he kept his precise means of escape secret, Frederick Douglass forged his own freedom papers and disguised himself as a sailor to make his way northward by train and steamboat. One abolitionist newspaper declared that, quote, "Slavery and the genius of invention hold no co-partnership. The principal inventive class of the South is that of the runaways, and is the hope of liberty that quickens their wits." The Black men and women who told their stories of escape made literacy a key element in their narratives. This was especially true for Frederick Douglass. In his first autobiography, published in 1845, Douglass famously narrated his initial encounter with literacy. Born in the isolated plantation on Maryland's eastern shore, the young Frederick Douglass was sent to the thriving city of Baltimore, where he lived with Hugh and Sophia Auld. Sophia began to teach, Sophia began to teach Douglass to read. When Hugh Auld, the husband, found out about these lessons, he exploded in anger. Education, he declared, would, quote, "forever leave him unfit to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it would make him discontented and unhappy." Douglass found these remarks revelatory. Ignorance, he had learned, was the root of the white man's power to enslave the Black man. Douglass used a variety of strategies to learn to read and write, whether it was trading food to neighborhood boys for reading lessons, or secretly practicing his writing in the used notebooks of his enslaver's son. When he used his small savings from odd jobs to purchase the Columbia Orator, that's when he first learned the art of rhetoric. As Auld predicted, Douglass' continued enslavement created a profound depression. Douglass wrote in his 1855 autobiography, quote, "To make a contented slave, you must make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision, and as far as possible, to annihilate his power of reason." Douglass made clear that literacy was a critical battle between enslavers and the enslaved. Taken back to the rural Eastern Shore at age 16, Douglass attempted to establish a Sunday school for free Blacks and the enslaved. White local religious leaders led a mob that shut down the Sunday school, pelting the students and the teacher with sticks and stones. Not one to easily give up, Douglass started a second Sunday school, secretly teaching 20 to 30 students. Though they might not have discovered this second school, local enslavers rightly considered Douglass dangerous precisely because of his literacy. Quote, "Knowledge of my ability to read and write got pretty widespread," he wrote, "which was very much against me." After leading a failed escape attempt, Douglass feared that he would be sold to the grueling plantations of the Deep South. But miraculously, his enslaver instead sent him back to Baltimore, where Douglass escaped a few years later. Solomon Northup's experience as a freedman kidnapped into slavery also profoundly highlighted the issues of literacy and creativity. As a free Black, Northup lived in the margins of Northern society, but the integrated common school of his small New York town nevertheless afforded him the opportunity to read and write. As you'll notice in the front piece of 12 Years a Slave, he signed his name as a testament to his literacy. Northup also learned to play the violin, which, as he put it, became the ruling passion of his youth. After holding a variety of jobs, Northup and his family moved to the resort town of Saratoga Springs, where he worked as a hackney driver and a valet at local hotels, while frequently performing as a violinist. Northup's hard work and creative labor, in conjunction with his wife Anne's renowned cooking, set them on a path to upward mobility. Those bright prospects came to a sudden and dramatic end. Luring Northup to Washington, D.C., with a well-paying job as a violin performer, two men kidnapped Northup and sold him into slavery. Brutally beaten and cruelly treated, Northup found himself in Louisiana's underdeveloped Red River region. The enslaved Northup nevertheless embodied the values of creative capitalism. On his own initiative, Northup fashioned rafts to transport lumber, built looms from scratch, crafted an improved axe handle, and invented the new fish trap. Northup's various initiatives enhanced the fortunes of his masters, highlighting the cruel irony that the creativity of the enslaved mostly benefited the enslavers. Northup's creativity, however, also gave him a sense of mastery and masculine pride in an otherwise dehumanizing world. He relished his intellectual superiority over his Southern masters. Northup's narrative also demonstrated why Southern enslavers carefully regulated education. From the beginning of his captivity, Northup hid his literacy, fearing harsh punishment if his enslavers knew he could read and write. Northup's secrecy added to the oppressiveness of his narrative, the need to hide, even from fellow slaves. Something as basic as literacy was psychologically debilitating, which perhaps accounts for Northup's impulse to invent and create in other realms. Literacy, though, offered Northup his best chance of escape if he could somehow post a letter to friends and relatives in the North. Acquiring even the basics of such as a paper and pen proved challenging and dangerous. But Northup liberated a sheet of paper from his master's wife and then developed his own ink from tree bark. Northup's scheme failed when a poor white laborer he had entrusted to mail his letter betrayed him. Northup faced certain torture, but his enslaver, the cruel Edwin Epps, actually believed Northup's passionate denials. Epps assumed that no slave could possibly learn to read and write, in part because Epps himself was uneducated. When describing Epps, Northup noted that, quote, his language gives speedy and unequivocal evidence that he's never enjoyed the advantages of an education. Northup only escaped when befriended by an artisan named Sam Bass, who actually hailed from Canada, and whose status as an educated and sympathetic outsider highlighted the cruelty and ignorance of the South's white society. Other authors of slave narratives, in contrast to Douglass and Northup, stress their lack of literacy. Recall that Ellen Craft dressed as a Southern gentleman while her husband William played the role of the loyal manservant. One flaw of their plan, they quickly realized, was that Ellen would be expected to sign papers along the way, such as the registers at hotels. Given that Ellen could not write, this was a major problem. Their solution was ingenious. Ellen would put her arm in a sling, pretending to have suffered a recent fall. That would explain her inability to sign her name while furthering her disguise. The Crafts pointed out that most Southern states made it a crime to teach an enslaved to read and write, and they highlighted the well-known case of Margaret Douglass, a Southern white woman who spent a month in jail for teaching Black children. William Wells Brown's popular slave narrative actually downplayed literacy, but his work was the exception that proved the rule. Brown's 1847 narrative was partly a reaction to Frederick Douglass's first autobiography, published 2 years earlier. Douglass presented himself as a heroic individual, stressing his own initiative. Brown, on the other hand, presented his emancipation as more of a collective effort. Brown did not dwell on a dramatic acquisition of literacy. Enslaved in St. Louis, Missouri, he was hired out to a white newspaper editor who, Brown casually remarked, quote, taught what little learning I obtained in slavery. Brown did not comment on literacy again until he escaped to the relative safety of Cleveland, Ohio. Yet, as soon as he arrived in Cleveland, he reported that, quote, I purchased some books and at leisure moments pursued them with considerable advantage to myself. The ironic understatement was almost comical. Brown was a towering intellect who would become a renowned novelist, playwright, and orator. Now, one of the key features of 19th century print culture was the growth of the number and the quality of illustrations. Black abolitionists took full advantage of these opportunities. Douglass and Bibb, for example, provided engraved portraits with their narratives. While the portraits conformed to the norms of middle-class respectability, their proud, determined, and challenging gazes focus directly on the reader. Notice that Bibb is holding a book that announces his literacy, while Douglass determinedly clenches his fist. These portraits were important acts of self-authentication. Since enslavers constantly questioned the authenticity of slave narratives, the narratives had endorsements testifying to their truthfulness. These endorsements almost always came from whites. Whiteness, in essence, was the arbiter of truth. The portraits, on the other hand, gave credence to the narratives without white intervention. They allowed Northern audiences to visualize Black citizenship. Bibb also illustrated his narrative with other images. As literary scholar Teresa Godu has noted, white abolitionists used illustrations that usually showed the enslaved as passive victims to white cruelty. Bibb used some of these stock illustrations, as you can see here, but he also commissioned his own engravings that stressed his own agency. Here is one of the best known of these illustrations, which pictures Bibb fighting off a pack of wolves to protect his wife and daughter. The wolves, savage, cruel, uncaring, were the perfect metaphor for the enslavers who constantly threatened the slave family. Bibb is at the center of the action, desperately wielding a stolen Bowie knife to successfully fend off the wolves. Now, images were particularly important to Frederick Douglass, who attached great importance to photography. Indeed, Douglass was probably the most photographed person of the 19th century. During the Civil War, Douglass gave several speeches on the theme of pictures in progress, in which he argued that the greatness and universality of pictures must exert a powerful, though silent influence upon the ideas and sentiments of present and future generations. Douglass provided several illustrations within his 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. The first, titled Life as a Slave, represented key abolitionist themes: a fugitive pursued by slave hounds, the separation of enslaved families at an auction, the aristocratic planter benefiting from the labor of enslaved families and workers. And you also see the towering plantation mansion in reference to the small and squalid slave cabin. The engravings prominently features symbols of nationalism, the oversized flags, the dome capitol in the background of the slave auction, that reminded readers that the power of the state supported slavery. Also notice these this black and white cat-like animal in the foreground, which may have referenced the mixed race slaves that abolitionists use as damning evidence of sexual violence inherent in slavery. The contrasting image, Life as a Freeman, was in many respects an idealized representation of creative capitalism. At the top, we see, At the top, we see symbols of economic progress. The canal boat, the telegraph wires, and of course, the locomotive. That the railroad assumes center stage is really not surprising. It was the most common and striking representation of 19th century capitalism and was also Douglas's means of escape. An auction for livestock replaces the slave auction, a reminder of the dehumanizing nature of slavery, as well as a nod to advances in scientific agriculture and livestock breeding. The church steeple, featured prominently in the background, emphasizes the flourishing of religion. The symbols of repressive national authority have receded. What might be a flag hangs loosely like a sheet flapping in the wind. Below is the schoolhouse, representing the North's commitment to education, and of course we see another church in the background. Notice on the far right the two plow horses, one black, one white, working side by side, perhaps symbolizing the possibilities of racial integration. Notice that the race of several of the school children are indistinct. While one is clearly white, the others are shrouded in racial ambiguity. Douglas seems to be holding out the possibility of an enlightened and integrated society. In such a society, he seems to be asking, why should race matter? The slave narratives and their images were great artistical and rhetorical achievements, but it's also important to realize that these works were commodities, material and performative manifestations of creative labor. Black abolitionists not only had rhetorical ties to creative capitalism, but economic ones as well. While creative labor was always precarious, that Black abolitionists nevertheless seized the opportunities of creative capitalism to advance themselves in the cause of Black citizenship. Douglas in particular achieved great fame as a writer and orator. Douglas was only exceptional in the degree of his success. The narratives of Northup and Brown also sold well, while Bibb and William and Ellen Craft became especially popular on the abolitionist speaking circuit. The cultural impact of these books and lectures was clear. White racism remained rampant in the North, and the abolitionists did lack political influence. But anti-slavery nevertheless dominated popular culture in the 1850s, especially in the literary marketplace where Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin became an immensely popular bestseller. It is doubtful that white writers such as Stowe could have succeeded without the work of Black abolitionists. Although Douglas had misgivings about Stowe's novel, in 1855, he proudly reported that Northerners lived in a new age when, quote, a picture of a Negro on the cover was a help to the sale of a book. The best evidence of the abolitionist cultural influence came from the enslavers themselves. Pro-slavery Southerners reacted to alarm when they saw how abolitionists increasingly dominated Northern culture. White Southerners were especially concerned that the anti-slavery message would mobilize Northern voters. Given the North's growing population advantage, a united anti-slavery North would spell the end of slavery. Southerners also worried that abolitionist literature would fall into the wrong hands and encourage more runaways and even perhaps slave revolts. In response, slaveholders produced their own pro-slavery literature, and they intensified a campaign of authoritarian oppression and censorship. Southern states banned abolitionist literature. They put the price on the heads of prominent Black and white abolitionists. They censored the males, and they sought to limit debate on slavery within the halls of Congress. Extra-legal violence was also part of the campaign of repression. Although Douglas, I'm sorry about that, when Senator Charles Sumner, one of the few abolitionists in Congress, delivered a stinging anti-slavery address in 1856, he was brutally beaten by a South Carolina congressman, which became a hugely important political episode in the late 1850s. Now, to be clear, the Southern strategy backfired in spectacular fashion. Northerners, whose economy depended upon the flow of information and knowledge, put a high value on free speech. Southern censorship and repression confirmed the violence, ignorance, and corruption of slavery that Black abolitionists had highlighted in such a compelling manner. A free press and free lips became a rallying cry for anti-slavery partisans. In February 1860, Abraham Lincoln's famous Cooper's Union address articulated the widespread fear that Southerners would never be satisfied until Northerners, quote, ceased to call slavery wrong and joined them in calling it right. And it must be done thoroughly, suppressing all declarations that slavery is wrong, whether made in politics, in presses, in pulpits, or in private. Later that year, Lincoln would win the presidency. While Lincoln was no abolitionist, his platform of restricting the westward expansion of slavery was sufficiently radical to prompt 11 Southern states to secede, setting off the Civil War. The creative labor of Black abolitionists was a critical catalyst to these events. Much like Brer Rabbit, the legendary trickster from Black folklore, the Black abolitionists had baited a far more powerful predator into making a series of critical mistakes. The Civil War led to the end of slavery, but it was also a turning point in the development of creative capitalism. The democratic vision of creative capitalism, in which educated, innovative, and inventive citizens drive economic development, gave way to an economy of large-scale corporations, which increasingly removed creativity from ordinary individuals. The Civil War and the integration of the nation's railroad networks created stronger national markets, which allowed large firms to centralize production and economic creativity. The ideal of the independent and creative citizen disappeared, giving way to an army of wage workers and middle managers. The agglomeration of capital and financial institutions increased the economic and political power of a Wall Street elite, which further deepened inequality. Gilded Age America still had one of the world's most innovative and inventive economies, but creative capitalism had lost its optimistic sense of democratic possibility. It is no surprise then that Black voices found themselves increasingly marginalized. Important victories were certainly won. A dramatic increase in Black literacy in the post-year wars created new markets for Black newspapers and Black literature. The Black literary societies established before the Civil War continued to flourish. The growth of Black readers and literature, though, was swamped by racist imagery and text, which were both a product and a cause of the North's failure to redistribute economic resources and protect the voting rights of Blacks. White Northerners lost the war, but in many respects, they won the peace. The economic inequality, political corruption, and virulent racism of the Gilded Age suggests that the link between creative capitalism and the expansion of democracy was highly contingent and historically specific. Without losing sight of the specifics of the 1850s, we can certainly hear the echoes of the Civil War period in our own politics. We too are experiencing a form of creative capitalism. The development of the internet, of cell phones and allied technologies has transformed access to knowledge, images, video, and entertainment in ways not too dissimilar to the telegraph, steam-powered printing press, and the railroad of the 19th century. We now have unparalleled access to information, literature, and art. We only need to look at the evolution of the digital humanities and the digital arts in our own campus to see how exciting these developments have been. Like its 19th century counterpart, the 21st century version of creative capitalism has been highly regionalized. States such as California and New York rely on highly innovative metropolitan areas to drive their economies, while states such as Louisiana and Tennessee rely far more on low-wage manufacturing, resource extraction, and corporate agriculture. The result is that creativity has helped to further polarize politics, reinforcing the divide between blue and red of creative and educational achievement. Even in purple states, such as North Carolina and Florida, creative cities tend to be aligned against ex-urban and rural areas. Universities, as centers of creativity, have become part of this political polarization, helping drive the economies of states like California are representing islands of blue and red states. As creativity has emerged as a key partisan dividing line, so too has the relationship between race and democracy. Indeed, there is an unnerving similarity between the elections of 1860 and 2020. As was the case in 1860, state-sanctioned violence against Blacks, the forcible separation of families, the right of free speech and peaceful protest are campaign issues. In the 1850s, pro-Southern, pro-slavery Democrats used explicit racial appeals and relied upon an undemocratic Supreme Court to protect their interest. In 2020, it's fair to say, anti-democratic forces have adopted similar positions. No major party in 2020 has threatened secession, as pro-slavery Southerners did in 1860, but on the other hand, the current administration has indicated that it might seek to invalidate the election on false charges of widespread voter fraud. And just as Southern states use extra-legal violence as a political tool to promote white supremacy, we have seen similar threats to do the same in 2020. Now, it should be clear that the injustices of creative capitalism are one of the reasons we have arrived at this difficult moment. California and New York, the bi-coastal anchors of today's version of creative capitalism, are among the nation's most economically unequal states. Creative capitalism has opened up exciting career opportunities for some, including many of our students, but has led to de-skilling for many others. While creative cities and regions pride themselves on their diversity, the workforce of the most successful technology companies often fails to reflect that diversity. Indeed, some of the corporations on the leading edge of creative capitalism showed little regard for democracy and social justice. In the 1850s, many prominent Northern merchants and industrialists opposed abolitionist agitation that endangered long-standing economic ties with the South. In similar fashion, companies like Facebook have profited from the spread of misinformation. Creative capitalism, it turns out, is still capitalism. In the 1850s, Northern Republicans naively hoped that free land in the West would reduce its inequalities and tame its excesses. We now know that doing so requires a strong regulatory state and a significant redistribution of wealth. It is hard for us to approach our politics today without a note of despair. 12 years ago, the United States elected our first Black president. Now we risk re-electing an authoritarian leader who explicitly stokes racial divisions and seeks to subvert democracy. That Black abolitionists can provide us with some guidance. For good reason, they had far graver doubts about American democracy than the most pessimistic 21st century progressive. For decades, the abolitionist cause seemed hopeless. Right until 1860, Southerners dominated national politics. Even the Republican Party seemed hopelessly beholden to Northern racism, and Black abolitionists still faced the threat of violence in the North as the Civil War approached. Yet Black abolitionists still had hope, however slender, that their creative labor and political activism could change the world. In 1855, Douglass vowed, quote, "to use my voice, my pen, or my vote, to advocate the great and primary work of the universal and unconditional emancipation of my entire race." We should heed Douglass' sentiments. To live democracy within creative capitalism requires us to acknowledge the very real possibility that our efforts may fail, and that our democracy might give way to racist and authoritarian impulses. Yet even as we confront these very real possibilities, we nevertheless must continue our creative labors on behalf of democracy and social justice, in the hope that circumstances will enable, as Lincoln put it, for right to make might. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being here, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Now I'll turn it back over to Susan.
Thank you, John, for a sobering and inspiring talk. I urge you to, our audience members, to write in your questions for us. I have one here that I will be able to convey to you now. An audience member has thanked you for your reflections on the parallels between 1860 and 2020, which are frightening and angering and also convincing. And the question is, how far outside of the antebellum and recent postbellum US can the creative capitalism thesis extend? That is, just to finish, can it account for intellectual laborers in other eras, for example? So how can we apply and extend the concept and conceptualization of creative capitalism?
Yeah, that's a really a good question. And so my own sense is that creative capitalism is somewhat new, and the you can probably trace its origins back to the 1830s, but it really takes off in the 1840s and the 1850s. And since that point, there's always a creative element to capitalism. And this is Joseph Schumpeter's famous conception of creative destruction, right? That there's always this element of creativity. I do think it is useful to think about creative labor, intellectual labor, in reference to creative capitalism, but I really strongly believe that the context and specifics of any given period are absolutely crucial in judging exactly how much power intellectual and creative labor will have, or how much influence. And so I think there were special circumstances in the 1840s and 1850s that I think didn't apply for most of the post-Civil War period. Now, I do think with the advent of new technologies beginning in the 1980s, that you begin to see this idea of kind of the creative individual, the creative citizen reassert itself. But I think kind of the same thing happened in the 19th century, where we had that kind of moment where we could kind of conceptualize creative capitalism going in that direction, or maybe hoping that would go in that direction, but it really didn't pan out. And it seems that the direction of creative capitalism now is towards ever increasingly large corporations and consolidation. And which, we as creative individuals still have ways of influencing the public sphere, of having kind of influence, but that ideal of kind of like the creative individual, I think has been lost to a large extent by 2020.
Are there religious parallels between the 1860 and 2020 elections, or between religious beliefs of abolitionists and white supremacists in the antebellum era?
Yeah, so this is like, this is a great question because it really demonstrates one of my glaring weaknesses as an historian. So I'm trained primarily as an economic history. And so, of course, being a historian of 19th century, I've had to learn some religious history, but it's really a great weakness of mine. And I apologize constantly to my students when they're taking courses like 17B or my Civil War course. But obviously the abolitionists, many of the abolitionists, rank and file abolitionists, are quite religious. Evangelical religion in the 19th century is actually on the side of the abolitionists, and the evangelicals are among the most liberals, at least evangelicals in the North. Now, not all evangelicals share abolitionist beliefs, and so the Southern Methodists, for example, the Southern Baptists, when those denominations break apart over the issue of slavery, that will be a very telling difference. Now in 2020, my sense is that evangelical religion is more on the side of conservative anti-democracy, and is more comfortable with authoritarian impulses than was the case in the 19th century. And so I would, without being an expert in religious history, I would say that it's flipped, that evangelicals have gone from liberal progressives, at least an element of that in the 19th century, to being largely more conservative in today's politics.
All right. After thanking you for a great talk, a colleague asks or says that she is curious about what you think was the source of the creative capitalism gap. Did it have origins in the different nature of the economies?
Yes, I do think that part of it was economic in nature. That as creativity took off in the North, people saw the value of investing institutions that furthered creativity. And so one of the things that made the United States fairly exceptional in the 19th century wasn't like this great sense of entrepreneurship that is sometimes argued, but it's actually public schooling and mass education. And one of the things that Northerners did is that they were willing to tax themselves for mass schooling and mass public education, which Southerners were not willing to do, and which white Southerners, the planter elite, really didn't see an economic payoff. Now, I think it goes beyond, though, just simple economics, and there are cultural values associated with economic systems. And I really think that Southern planters and Southern elites saw widespread education, widespread creativity as an absolute danger to a slave society and to their survival. So they could take bits and pieces of creativity, like Southerners were keen to build railroads if they made plantations more efficient, but they were not keen on making it widespread. And they were really more focused, especially by the 1840s and 1850s, on a sense of repression and repressing creativity rather than furthering it.
All right, we have time for one more question only, although we have rich and diverse questions entered for you, which I will convey to you afterwards.
Sure.
I'm going a really broad, hard one.
Okay, sounds great.
Which is, what is it about education today that provides a poor antidote to racism? And obviously you can approach that question in so many ways. Do you agree with the assumption? And if you do, how do you respond?
Isn't like the solution to racism. I totally agree with those sentiments. But I think education is important. And again, I'm not an expert on the 20th are, the more open you are um, uh, uh, to ideas of racial justice and ideas of social justice. And this is one of the reasons why creativity has created such strong partisan divides in our society. That at least among whites, one of the most important demographic factors in terms of partisan affiliation is level of education. And obviously that's not the case that every educated college education person is going to vote for Democrats, and every non-college educated person is going to vote for Republicans, but there is a strong general correlation. So I think education is a really important part of the anti-racism message, but I think obviously it has to go beyond that. I think some degree of economic redistribution of resources is completely necessary. I think policies such as universal health care, to make it clear to people that society isn't the zero-sum game, that if some people gain, then therefore you lose, are also absolutely important. So I wouldn't say education is like the answer, but I think it's an important part of the answer.
And if I could just comment that the attention you gave to the different rhetorical and pictorial strategies of slave narratives, and of, even in your concluding slide, the power and crucial impact of the pen of story does call our attention to what the humanities do.
Yes,
So I
absolutely. A very good note to end the discussion on.
And so here at the Humanities Center, we must end our first event in Living Democracy. My thanks again to John Majewski for such an inspiring and energizing inaugural lecture, to our interpreters, and of course to the audience for attending and participating. May I ask you, if you will, to please fill out the post-event survey. It's only going to take a minute. You can also sign up for our mailing list to receive our future events. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of the evening. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.